A class in Chapter 1 um, covers various research methods that are used to study human behavior. And in social psychology, the emphasis is on understanding how people are influenced by others or the perceived um, presence of other people. So it has a lot to do with group behavior as opposed to study of individual characteristics, which you saw a lot more of in Introduction to Psychology. And I'm not going to go over everything in Chapter 1, but I did want to talk a little bit about correlational research and a little bit about experiments because those are two topics that students are likely to miss questions from in Chapter 1. So just a few things here. Correlational research is used to detect naturally occurring relationships among variables. And what that means is just that, unlike an experiment where you might think of that as more like a, a researcher who's exposing people to something and then measuring the consequence of that. Well, correlational research is just measuring two variables, recording the presence of two variables to see if there's a trend or correlation. So I put that on the screen here. The correlation just means that there's a trend between two variables. The big thing about correlations is that if it's a strong trend, it can help us to predict something. So we know there's a strong correlation between certain psychological disorders and suicide, for example. And so like major depressive disorder, for example, is one disorder that has a stronger correlation to suicide than a lot of other disorders. And that would allow us to predict that somebody who has major depressive disorder would be at higher risk for a suicide attempt than somebody with a different disorder, perhaps. So the only major weakness, at least, of correlational research is that it can't tell us what's causing the correlation. All it's telling us is that there's a relationship or a trend between these two things or these two variables. So because we didn't do an experiment where you're manipulating a variable and seeing what the consequence of that is, measuring that consequence specifically, we don't really know what the cause is. And so I just want to do a couple examples to make that distinction. Now this is actual data from elementary schools in the state of Illinois. And it's a little bit old, but I'm just using it as an example. You guys probably remember taking achievement tests at different grade levels during elementary school, and I think it probably at least once in high school. Well, this is a data from elementary schools in Illinois, and this was the reading test that students took. And this is data is showing on this axis here the percentage of students in the school who were from low-income families, and over on this axis is the percentage of students in that school who meet or exceed the reading standards. So you notice that there's kind of a trend in that the schools that have lots of low-income students, so look at all these schools down here, they all have a high percentage of low-income students. And then you look at the percentage of kids in the school who are achieving or meeting the state expected learning standards for reading, and they're all pretty low. You know, in this case, they're all between 30 and 40%. On the other hand, you look at schools that have fewer percentage of students who are low income. Like all these schools over here have a low percentage of students who are low income. and you look at how are those schools performing in terms of reading standards. Well, all these schools have uh, about 70 to 90% of their students performing at or above the state reading standards. So the valuable thing from data like this is that we can see a trend or a correlation between income status, low income status, and school achievement, at least in this case, when it comes to reading. And so we could predict that schools that have a high percentage of students who are low income are going to have a lower percentage of students who are meeting or exceeding the state standards in reading. And the good thing about that is knowing that correlation exists, then maybe we can try out some things that could help low-income students achieve better reading scores or learn to be better readers. And that's the valuable thing about correlations. But you'll notice from this example that researchers didn't assign a low-income status to a school. And you don't assign a performance on the reading test. So this is not an experiment, of course. This is a correlational research because we're just measuring the variables as they naturally occur here. And you could do that easily enough. You would know how many students in your school, for example, qualify for the reduced fee or free lunch programs because of their family's income status. So it wouldn't be very hard to do a study like this, but all we can do is say that there's a relationship between income status and reading achievement scores. We don't really know what's causing that. So research has demonstrated a correlation between the number of hours of violent television children watched and the amount of aggression in those children. Based on these findings and what we know about correlational research, we can conclude that A, aggressive children mimic or imitate the violence they see on television shows. B, parents who allow their children to view violent television are indirectly encouraging aggressive behavior. C, watching violent television leads to aggression. Or D, we cannot conclude any of the above. Now you can pause this for a little bit if you want to think about the answers, but I'm going to go ahead and move on here with this. So what is the best answer? Well, because this is a correlation, we don't know what's causing it. Because unlike an experiment, we don't assign children a certain amount of violence to watch. We don't assign children a certain amount of aggressive behavior. All we know is that there's a trend based on this study. So the correct answer is D. We can't conclude any of the answers above because we really don't know what's causing it. All we know is that there was a correlation or a trend between those two. Now, it could be that watching violence on TV was causing those kids to be more aggressive, but quite honestly, it could be that kids who are naturally aggressive prefer to watch shows on TV that have more violence compared to non-aggressive kids anyway. So we don't really know what's causing this correlation. All we can say is that there's a trend or correlation there. One of my favorite examples from recent years was this story that appeared in the news that a research team in Taiwan found that the best predictor for the use of birth control methods in a household was the number of electric appliances in the home. So, of course, they didn't do an experiment where they assigned birth control to anybody or assigned people a certain number of electrical appliances to buy. They just surveyed people in various homes throughout Taiwan and asked them if they were using birth control and asked them how many electric appliances they had. And they found a correlation. They asked them all kinds of information, but from all the information they gathered from people, these were the only two things that correlated, that there was a trend, and they thought that was interesting. Well, there's three possible explanations for this correlation. One is that it's possible that birth control is causing people to buy more electric appliances, which sounds silly. Secondly, it could be that buying electric appliances causes people to use birth control. Well, that sounds kind of silly too. The third possible explanation, though, is that there's some other variable that wasn't measured that can explain why some people buy birth control and why those same people buy more electric appliances. And you probably guessed it already. It probably has to do with how much money or income families have. So families that have a lot of income would be more likely to afford birth control, and families that have more income would have more money to buy convenience products like electric appliances. So the point is, again, just because there's a correlation doesn't mean one variable causes the other. It could be the case, but we don't know for sure. So we just have to interpret those results cautiously.